Intrusive thoughts can also be the result of trauma. It's important not to judge yourself and not to start thinking that there's something wrong with me. Hi, this is Jim Breon. Welcome to this YouTube channel where we discuss all things mental health. What I'm going to be talking about today are intrusive thoughts. When I mention intrusive thoughts, what that means is, the average person on an average day has literally thousands of thoughts throughout the day. And they could range from, the sandwich is good, to what time is it? Oh my God, am I late? To what am I going to do tomorrow? Our thoughts can be almost like popcorn, just bouncing all over the place. Intrusive thoughts are thoughts that people have that are unwanted, often repetitive, and they're connected to urges to act out sometimes. And they're things that people find disturbing often. One of the reasons that intrusive thoughts are distressful is because they tend to be ego dystonic. What that means is they are not in line with who you see yourself as a person. They're not in line with your values. For most people, they're fleeting, and there's no danger of acting on them. I think that's something that scares people sometimes, is if they have a fleeting, intrusive, dangerous thought, they might act on it. These could be thoughts like, if you're in the kitchen cutting vegetables, a fleeting thought might pass through your mind, maybe I should stab that person. Or you might see yourself stabbing a person. Or people will be driving on the freeway and a fleeting thought would be, what would it be like if I turned the wheel and I drove into the wall? Or, walking on a tall bridge or something like this, and people will have a fleeting thought of jumping. And it can really terrify people because they feel like they might lose control and actually act on those urges. There actually isn't a danger that you're going to act on those things. So I think it's important to identify them as intrusive thoughts that are fleeting. The French actually have a name for this. They call it l'appel de vide, which means the call of the void. And when we do have these fleeting thoughts, it's actually important not to start assigning meaning to them, to recognize them as a fleeting thought and let them go. There's one school of thought that thinks that these might be misinterpreted safety signals. In other words, the brain is trying to tell you to be careful in this situation, but your brain interprets that as what would happen if I weren't careful. Most importantly, if you have fleeting intrusive thoughts, that you don't assign meaning to them and you don't start ruminating about them, and that you don't assume that there's something wrong with you or you have a death wish, that type of thing. Now, these types of intrusive thoughts can also be the sign of an underlying anxiety disorder like obsessive compulsive disorder. And this can be very distressful for people that are living with OCD, especially certain forms of OCD. It can actually be debilitating. There's something called harm OCD, where people have constant intrusive thoughts that they're going to hurt somebody that they love, or act out in an immoral way, or that they're going to kill themselves or kill another person. So for somebody that has a condition like harm OCD, because of the nature of the OCD brain, they really struggle with having a sense of certainty. There's some research that suggests that the prefrontal cortex, normally as we think through a thought process, we think this and we think that and we think this and that, and we start getting problem solving and we come up with a conclusion and we go, okay, well, that's done. You don't have to think about that anymore. But in an OCD brain, when you get to that point, all of that information goes back into the cortex for reprocessing. So you can see how this loop of thinking happens. And for somebody who struggles with intrusive thoughts because of OCD, it can be very, very difficult. Generally, intrusive thoughts can be triggered by high stress, by anxiety, hormonal shifts, and also by isolation. We all saw how life changed drastically during the pandemic. And many people at that time struggled with these kinds of intrusive thoughts. And ultimately, intrusive thoughts can also be the result of trauma. So if you have intrusive thoughts, how do we cope with them? First of all, identifying them as what they are, an intrusive thought, a fleeting thought, rather than assigning meaning to it or getting trapped in our own mind questioning, why would I think something like that? Is there something wrong with me? Am I crazy? Am I weird? Recognize that, it's an intrusive thought. And that's not what I want. That's not what I think. That's not what I believe in. So it's not about fighting with the thoughts, but really about diffusing it. And thought diffusion is a process that we use to create some psychological distance between ourselves and our own thoughts. So it's sort of like thinking, interesting, I noticed that I had that thought. And that's about it. And you let it move on. It's important not to judge yourself and not to start thinking that there's something wrong with me. And if it gets to the point where it's disturbing, disrupting, and impairing your life, then it's actually time to reach out for some help. Mindfulness practice can be very helpful in coping with intrusive thoughts. One definition of mindfulness that I think is helpful is that it's learning how to pay attention on purpose in the present moment with compassion and non-judgment. So the paying attention part, we're talking about training yourself to focus on the present moment, on your moment-to-moment experience. Noticing when your mind wanders or gets distracted or an intrusive thought pops in, and learning how to let them go. It involves awareness and acceptance. Acceptance of our thoughts and our moment-to-moment experience with curiosity and without judgment. And then choosing to return back to the present moment, to focus on your breath if you're meditating or some object where you're putting your focus. And finally, mindfulness involves being kind to oneself, practicing compassion for yourself and loving kindness for self and others. So when intrusive thoughts do become a sign of an underlying issue is when it's chronic, causing concern, and then it's time to talk to a mental health professional. Working with a therapist who practices CBT or ERP. CBT is cognitive behavioral therapy. It's one modality that's been shown to be highly effective coping with intrusive thoughts, as well as ERP, which is exposure therapy, where you're trained to notice your thoughts but not act upon them. And mindfulness-based cognitive therapy can be very helpful. Then there's the question of, how do I talk to other people about my intrusive thoughts? Should I talk with people about that? It's a good question. And it can really be helpful to tell a trusted person what's happening inside your mind, as long as the aim is to help them understand and to support you. But we want to be careful about this, because especially if we have obsessive thoughts, and maybe a person has OCD, to obsessively talk about all of those thoughts is a compulsion, which is thought to reduce anxiety and stress in the short term, but actually perpetuates the OCD cycle. So you have to be careful about not compulsively talking about all of this to actually keep it perpetuated. One question to ask yourself if you're thinking about talking with somebody about your intrusive thoughts is this cathartic or is it a compulsion? And maybe the way to talk with somebody about it could be, along the lines of, I realize that I have something called OCD. What that means is I have a lot of obsessive thoughts. Sometimes they're intrusive and sometimes they really bother me. And I tend to do things to try to not have them. And I'm learning about it, I'm getting help, and I know that I'm not a danger to myself or others. And that way you can inform somebody about what's going on with you, but you don't fall into that habit of compulsively obsessing about the thoughts. And in effect, that form of conversation is a form of ERP, which is exposure and response prevention. In other words, talking about the obsessions but not acting on them. I hope this is helpful, and if so, I encourage you to like and subscribe and sign up for notifications so we can let you know when more videos are coming out. Until the next time, take care of yourself and take care of each other.